1992, Spanish flu hit Thursday Island, and George died, leaving the family in a bit of debt because the pearling industry was also beginning to crash, and so Mary tried to run the business as best she could. James, my grandfather, decided he had to get a job to support the family, so he got a job selling pearls overseas with the Japanese pearling company, and that entailed him traveling often to Hong Kong, Macau, Shanghai, and Taipei in Taiwan. Now, during this time in the 20s, Taiwan was a colony of Japan, and the West were quite worried about Japan building up its strength in Asia. So the British actually recruited my grandfather to spy on the Japanese. And so I think it was in the early 20s, he was just about to leave Taipei, and as he was going through customs, he got apprehended, and they opened up his suitcase and found the suitcase was full of maps. So justice was pretty swift in those days, so he was sentenced to be executed. And luckily for him, his boss just happened to be in Taipei, and so paid quite a large bribe for him to be released, and he jumped on that boat and escaped that very day. And so he never did that anymore, so he returned to Australia. By that time, my great-grandmother decided that there was no future on Thursday Island, so she packed up the whole family, and they moved to Tully in 1925. Now, the reason we moved to Tully was because there was another Chinese Thursday Island family that had moved here about 4 years before them, and that was the Kum Yuan family. And so when the Singhs moved here, they lived with the Kum Yuans, and they worked in their store, so they had quite a large store here. About 2 years later, in 1927, the Kum Yuans left, and they moved to Port Douglas and then Cairns. The Kum Yuan family later became the Tong family, and they are the ones who own the very well-known transport company, Tong Singh's. So the Tong Singh's company is people that own that, originally from Tully. My family also, because the Kum Yuans left, they moved to Innisfail, the whole Singh family, and they lived there for most of their lives. So most of the Singhs are actually from Innisfail. In 1927, after the Kum Yuans left, my grandfather decided to come back, and he opened up his own store, which he called Tully Cash Stores. And Tully Cash Stores was situated where today's Tackle Village is. He made quite a lot of money, and so within a couple of years, he also started a timber mill, and he had a earth-moving transport company, and he owned 3 farms. One of the farms was just near where I think it's BP is today. He owned the old DeBella farm, which is on the Mission Beach turnoff on the hill there, and he also owned a farm on the highway on the eastern side, just north of Buckle Creek. So he had 3 farms, and he grew sugarcane and bananas. So back in those days, most of the sugarcane and banana farmers in the really early years were Chinese. 1930, he got married to a lady called Ellen Geekie. So Ellen Geekie was the oldest daughter of Tam Geekie, who was probably the richest and most prominent Chinaman on the Palm River goldfields. And he had packed up and took his family back to China in 1906. But after he died, the family, who'd grown up quite privileged, quickly ran out of money. And so they all, one at a time, had to come back, and they all moved to South Johnson. Now, back in those days, Chinese women had very little value, so they were quite a burden on the family. And so when the 3 daughters came back, so there was Ellen, the second daughter was Maud, and the third daughter was Lily. They came back to South Johnson, and they moved from brother to brother, and they stayed with the Geekies. There was a Geekie store in South Johnson that was quite popular. When my grandfather, James, married Ellen, she moved to Tully and she worked at the store. But she also brought her 2 sisters. So all three sisters lived with my grandfather and worked at the store. So everyone knows Chinese like a good deal. He got 3 for 1. Tragedy struck in 1933. Ellen got cancer, stomach cancer, and she died very, very quickly. And she is buried right down there in the front there. So she was one of the first people buried at the cemetery. Lily, the youngest, met a man called Charles Howkey. Howkey family is from Innisfail. And she got married, and her and Charles moved to Brisbane. Maud continued to live with James for a few years, and in 1936 they got married. So yeah, he married his first wife's sister, which apparently was quite common in those days. In 1937 they had their first son, George James Singh, who was my father. Everyone knows him as James. The second son was Alfred John, which was born in 1938, and the third son was Robert Ray, who was born in 1940. Alfred only lived a couple of days because he died in a tragic accident and Maud dropped him on his head. And he's buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the cemetery here. My grandfather was known to be a very, very generous man. And he used to participate in a lot of charitable groups. One of the groups that he used to spend a lot of time in was the Chinese War Relief Fund. And what they used to do is they used to travel up and down the coast of Queensland, and they used to try and raise money to help the Chinese fight the Japanese, this is before Australia entered the war. So he was the president, and the vice president was a guy called Archie Warburton, who some of you might have heard of. So during the war, a lot of people didn't, especially the farmers, they didn't have a lot of money to buy stuff, which really affected his business. So often he would tell people that he would allow them to get produce on credit as long as they promised to pay it back after the war. But unfortunately, after the war, a lot of those people refused to pay him back. And so he went into a lot of debt, and he had to sell his store, Tully Cash Stores. And he sold that to the Taylor family. So the store later became Taylor's, and they moved it down the street a little bit. My grandfather, he had a lot of hobbies. One of his hobbies was spearfishing. He's the first documented person to ever spearfish in south of Thursday Island. He also, one of his passions was dogs, and he was the first person in Far North Queensland to have a Labrador. And he brought a couple up here and he bred them. And he was very good at training dogs. So if anyone can remember, in the late 50s, he used to have a dog called Rio, a black lab, and he would train that dog to carry a basket down the street. And he'd put a shopping list, he'd put some money in there. He'd tell the dog which store to go to. The dog would go to the store, give the list to the storekeeper. The storekeeper would put the items in there, take the money, put the change in, and the dog would come back. And so that dog was quite famous in town. My grandfather's biggest weakness was sweets. He was a massive sweet tooth, and it ended up being his demise. He developed diabetes in the 60s, and because of that, he had to sell 2 of his farms. The third farm he gave to my father. My grandmother we used to fight with him all the time at the end there, because my grandfather sort of ignored the fact that he was diabetic. And we had the only ice cream machine in town at one point. And he would make ice cream for people, but when he went to clean the machine, he always made sure he left about 10% in the machine. And when he went down the stairs to clean it, he'd always eat it. He would also sneak the dog out and send the dog down to get some boiled lollies, which was his favourite. And that's why I've got some boiled lollies here as an offering to my grandfather. So my grandmother, Maud, she died in 1983, and she's also buried in the cemetery up here. So my grandfather, he was, I'm very proud of my grandfather because he grew up in a time when, he grew up in a time when there's a lot of discrimination against Chinese. And he was still very successful. Okay, today we're doing something very special. I know a lot of you haven't absorbed anything I've said because you're still wondering why I look like I'm going to Sydney Mardi Gras. Today we're going to, my family and I are going to do a lion dance for my grandfather, which is very special in our culture. And we were just lucky that we've got 9 lions in our house at the moment left over from the parade. So we're just going to do a little quick performance for everyone.